Hello, and welcome to another Seth book analysis stream. I'm Heretic, and tonight we are indeed continuing with Volume 2 of The Unknown Reality, a Seth book by Jane Roberts. As usual, I will be both reading and commenting on the material. Okay, sounds like test. Okay, we are good. Oh, I thought I paused that. So give me another 30 seconds or so to finish setting things up, and then we shall begin. Share this to Twitter. Live with more of this fucking thing. Of the unknown reality. This is highly problematic. For some reason, anytime I want to share a link through Twitter on my phone, if I'm not careful, it will distort things. For fuck's sakes. Hang on. Talking about the end of the world. That ought to sound enticing. Okay, now let me just double check that posted, and these annoyances will be over and we can officially begin. Okay, yes. Tweet looks good. Everything looks good. So let's dive in. We are, in fact, now nearing the end of the main part of the book. We really only have, I believe, 4 sessions to go until we reach the appendix, but the appendix in this book is huge, and so it will take us quite a long time to get through as well. But anyway, without further ado, let us begin. Session 741, April 14th, 1975, 9:21 p.m. Monday. All I know, Jane said tonight at 8:50, is that I want to get back to the sessions again. I don't care whether we get stuff on unknown reality or personal material or what, just so we get going. I'm always nervous about starting things up again after a layoff. Footnote. Checking, I soon discovered that Jane had said much the same thing as we sat for the 708th session following a 3-month break in book sessions. See the opening notes. End of footnote. She made her remarks after I'd read her Seth's last session, the 740th, for February 2nd, from my notes earlier this evening. I still don't have it typed. Incredibly, that session is already 6 weeks old. We've been involved in so many activities since then that it's difficult to decide which of them to refer to in these notes and to what extent. Except for the few listed below, then it may be sufficient to just state that we've been in our hill house for a month, and that after much hard physical labor, we've settled down enough to resume our natural rhythms of painting, sessions, books, and play. Footnote. A number of our friends, some of them members of ESP class, helped us move on Saturday, March 15th. They even furnished the trucks. Their strenuous efforts will be endlessly appreciated. Anyone who has ever carried heavy furniture or innumerable boxes of goods up and down steep and turning flights of stairs will understand the gratitude Jane and I feel. End of footnote. I have a room I'm converting into a studio and one in which to work on this manuscript. And for the first time since we married 20 years ago, in 1954, Jane has a room to herself for her own writing, if she chooses to use it. So far, she's preferred to work before the picture window in the living room. Oh, and by the way, full disclosure here, the subject for which this stream is titled, The Idea of the End of the World, is happening or is being discussed in the second session that we'll be looking at tonight. So it's going to be like, I don't know, a half hour or so until we get to that, just in case there's anyone who found that particularly interesting and wants to just like focus only on that part. Our house connections continue to accumulate, often in unexpected ways. From her own viewpoint, Jane has already produced for Psychic Politics some very perceptive material on our move to the Hill House. Quote, so we made our own special place in more ordinary terms, by symbolizing that particular house and corner, marking it ours, stamping it with the imprint of living symbols which we transposed upon it. Henceforth it had a magic quality, end quote. Footnote. This passage is from chapter 20 of Politics. Then see chapter 21 for more of Jane's material on our moving. Hey, Poetic. Hey, Seamus. Good to see you here, mister. Let's see, where were we? Jane hasn't restarted ESP class yet. We're not sure when we'll be able to manage that. Class may have to wait until Seth finishes his work on unknown reality. We've largely finished correcting proofs on both the text and the drawing captions for Jane's Adventures in Consciousness, which will be published in June. We've also seen a first color proof of the jacket design for her dialogues, scheduled for publication next fall. Footnote. Material and further references concerning production details for Adventures in Dialogues can be found in the opening notes for sessions 718 and 735. Also see note 1 for the latter session. End of footnote. As if to celebrate our way of life and work in the house on the hill, we were visited last Saturday by Tam Mosman, Jane's editor at Prentice Hall, and a publishing colleague of his. One result of our meeting, as I wrote at the beginning of the introductory notes for Volume 1, was the decision to publish this long manuscript for Unknown Reality in 2 volumes. Footnote. 5 months ago in the 721st session, I noted Jane's speculations, quote, that Unknown Reality might prove to be so long that it could go into 2 volumes, a probable development I hardly took seriously, end quote, end of footnote. Yes, 2 volumes indeed, which is just made even lengthier still by Rob's rather extraneous notes, I would say. But, you know, that's how they wanted to do it. In ordinary terms, I think that during our first month in the Hill House, we've been busy forming a fresh psychic atmosphere within which we can feel comfortable, and that anyone in a similar situation intuitively does the same thing. Perhaps not until a start is made in this way can any of us initiate certain function in the quote-unquote new place. Actually, then, we seek to wed the old environment with the new, using the psyche as a bridge between the 2 worlds. Now when Jane and I drive past the old house we lived in on Water Street, close by downtown Elmira, we engender within ourselves mixed feelings of strangeness and familiarity. We see the intimately known windows of the 2 apartments we shared still vacant, the blinds hanging at careless angles. Friends have told us both places are being redecorated to a modest degree. I'm glad they're being changed, Jane said the other day, in a strangely possessive response. That means the world we had there can't ever be entered by anyone else. In that big, intriguing house, her whole psychic world, and mine, had begun to open up late in 1963. Various aspects of that becoming are detailed in her different books. Yet when Jane left the Water Street apartments that day in March, she never looked back. When she's through with something, she's through with it. She's remarkably free in that way. I'm the one who's apt to become attached to old things, old places, to look back with a bit of nostalgia. Now, as we waited for tonight's session to begin, our 14-year-old cat, Willie, dozed on the couch beside me. At the same time, our black cat, Rooney, who died in his 5th year, lay in his grave in the backyard of the house on Water Street. Footnote. For material on the death and life of Rooney, see these sources in Personal Reality, sessions 638 through 39 in chapters 9 and 10, respectively, and Dialogues, Part 3. End of footnote. It's always particularly sad for me when that is brought up, by the way. Just to add a bit more background to myself here, I guess, because I once had a black cat. Her name was Misty. I had her for 15 years, and she was like the most delightful cat ever. We had like such a freaking like psychic connection and everything. She was highly communicative, and she died a couple years ago. Made her departure into the non-physical realms, and I've been sad as hell about it ever since. Jane lit a cigarette and sipped at a beer. Then she took off her glasses. By the time she laid them on the coffee table between us, she was in trance. Speaking as Seth, she began to very comfortably and easily deliver the next session for Unknown Reality. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. Dictation, quietly and humorously. The unknown reality appears to be invisible only because you do not accept it in your prime series of events. See the last session. It is as if you had trained yourselves to respond to red lights and to ignore green ones, for example, or as if you read only every 3rd or 4th line on a page of a book. You attend to matters that seem to have practical value. Whether or not you understand what space is, you move through it easily. You do not calculate how many steps it takes you to cross a room, for instance. You do not need to understand the properties of space in scientific terms in order to use it very well. You can, underlined, see yourselves operate in space, however. To that extent, it is a known quality, apparent to the senses. Your practical locomotion is involved with it, so you recognize it. Its mysterious or less known properties scarcely concern you. Now, you move through probabilities in much the same way that you navigate in space. As you do not consciously bother with all of the calculations necessary in the process of walking down the street, so you also ignore the mechanisms that involve motion through probable realities. You manipulate through probabilities so smoothly, in fact, and with such finesse, that you seldom catch yourself in the act of changing your course from one probability to another. 934. Take a very simple action. You stand at a corner, wondering which direction to take. There are 4 streets involved. You briefly consider streets 1 and 2, but rather quickly decide against them. You stand for a moment longer, gazing down street 3, taking in the visual area. You are somewhat attracted, and imagine yourself taking that course. Your imagination places you there momentarily. Inner data is immediately aroused through conscious and unconscious association. Perhaps you are aware of a few memories that dimly come to mind. One house might remind you of one a relative lived in years ago. A tree might be reminiscent of one that grew by your family home. But in that instant, inner computations occur as you consider making a fairly simple decision, and the immediate area is checked against all portions of your knowledge. Footnote. Seth gave 2 blocks of material in Seth Speaks that are analogous to what he tells us here. In Chapter 7, see the 530th session at 9:30, when he discoursed upon our frequent projection of quote-unquote replica images or pseudo-physical forms to vividly desired locations. In the 565th session at 9:30 for Chapter 16, he used the example of one's possible responses to a telephone call to show how all, quote, probable actions are equally valid, end quote, no matter which one of them is physically actualized. End of footnote. You then look at Street 4. The same process happens again. This area also takes your attention. At the same time, you almost equally hold in your mind the image of Street 3, for you can see them both at once from this intersection. Let us say that you are almost equally attracted to both courses. You teeter between probabilities, underlined having the full power to choose one street or the other as physical experience. If you had to stand there and write down all the thoughts and associations connected with each course of action before you made your decision, you might never cross the intersection to begin with. You might be hit by an automobile as you stood there, lost in your musings. In the same way, it would take you some time to even walk from a table to a chair if you had to be underlined consciously aware of all of the nerves and muscles that must first be activated. But while you stand almost equally attracted by streets 3 and 4, then you send out mental and psychic energy in those directions. Past associations merge with present reality and form a pattern. Mentally, a part of you actually starts out upon each street, a projected mental image, period. As you stand there, then, in this case, two such projected images go out onto streets 3 and 4. To some extent, these images experience, quote unquote, what will happen if you yourself take one direction or the other. That information is returned to you instantaneously, and you make your decision accordingly. Say you choose street 4. Physically, you begin to walk in that direction. Street 4 becomes your physical reality. You accept that experience in your prime sequence of events. You have, however, already sent out an energized mental image of yourself into street 3, and you cannot withdraw that energy. 953. The portion of you that was attracted to that route continues to travel it. At the point of decision, this alternate self made a different conclusion, that it experienced street 3 as physical reality. The self as you think of it is literally reborn in each instant, following an infinite number of events from the one official series of events that you recognize at any given quote-unquote time. There is something highly important here concerning your technological civilization. As your world becomes more complicated in those terms, you increase the number of probable actions underlined practically available. The number of decisions multiplies. You can physically move from one place on the planet to another with relative ease. And considering that this session is literally from the 70s, imagine how that is just that much more true today, with our insanely technological age, with so much information coming at us and so many options and so many choices, YouTube videos and Netflix things we can check out and different, I don't know, just all kinds of things. What news story are you going to read? Like, who you're going to follow and not follow on social media, who you're going to interact with and not interact with. So many more possibilities and probabilities today. You can physically move, right? We read that, from one place on the planet to another with relative ease. Centuries ago, ordinary people did not have the opportunity to travel from one country to another with such rapidity. As space becomes quote-unquote smaller, your probabilities grow in complexity. Your consciousness handles far more space data now. In parentheses, I am speaking in your terms of time. Watching television, you are aware of events that occur on the other side of the Earth, so your consciousness necessarily becomes less parochial. Footnote. In Chapter 10 for Personal Reality, see the 675th session from 1151. In Volume 1 of Unknown Reality, see the 686th session from 1037. End of footnote. As this has happened, the whole underlined matter, smiling, of probabilities has begun to assume a more practical cast. Civilizations are locked one into the other. Politicians try to predict what other governments will do. Ordinary people try to predict what their government might do. More and more, you are beginning to deal with probabilities as you try to ascertain which of a number of probable events might physically occur. When the question of probabilities is a practical one, then scientists will give it more consideration. The entire subject is very important, however. As far as a true psychology is concerned, individuals who are made aware of the existence of probable realities will no longer feel trapped by events. Your consciousness is at a point where it is beginning to understand the significance of quote-unquote predictive action, and predictive action always involves probabilities. Underlined, in certain terms, underlined, you are the recognized quote-unquote result of all of the decisions you have made up to this point in your life. That is the official you. Footnote. See note 2 for session 695 in volume 1. End of footnote. You are in no way diminished because other quite as official selves are quote-unquote offshoots of your own experience, making the choices you did not make and choosing, then, alternate versions of reality. You follow the prime series of events that you recognize as your own, yet all of you are connected. Long pause, eyes closed. These are not just esoteric statements, but valid clues about the nature of your own behavior, meant to give you a sense of your own freedom, and to emphasize the importance of your choice. Take your break. 10:23. Jane was very quickly out of a fine trance that had lasted for just over an hour. Willie had slept beside me all of the time, twisting himself into a variety of positions. I feel relaxed, relieved, and exhausted now that we've started things up again, Jane said, yawning. I almost think I could go to bed right now, but I know I won't. There. I just picked up the next 2 or 3 sentences for after break, she said as she got up and moved about. But they can wait. Resume at 10:53. Now, dictation again, loudly. Whenever you try to predict behavior or events, then you are dealing with probabilities. However, it seems to you that all action in the past is fixed and done, while behavior in the future alone is open to change. So the word prediction assumes future action. Basically, the past is as open to change as the future is. When you are dealing with historic events, you believe that no prediction is involved. Personally, and as a species, you are convinced that there is a one-line series of finished events behind you. In The Nature of Personal Reality, I stated that the point of action occurs in the present. Footnote. Among the sessions for personal reality in which Seth stressed that the present is the point of power, see the 657th in chapter 15. End of footnote. In Adventures in Consciousness, Rubert said, quite properly, that time experience actually splashed out from the present to form an apparent past and future. Footnote. See chapter 10 of Adventures. End of footnote. When you seemingly look backward into time and construct a history, you do so by projecting your own prime series of events into the past as it is understood. Obviously, you read the past from the present, but you also underlined create it from the present as well. You accept certain data, your present recognized series of events, then use that series as a measuring stick, so to speak. It automatically rejects what does not fit. At certain levels of experience, this makes little difference. All data agree. No rough spots show. 11:05. Give us a moment. Pause. You build smooth structures of beliefs, then look at reality using the beliefs like glasses, tinted ones. Period. Opposing information will literally be invisible to you. Footnote. For one of the ways in which Seth explicates the idea that we're blind to information or beliefs that we don't agree with, see the 617th session for chapter 3 of Personal Reality. End of footnote. It will be ignored or cast aside. It has been fashionable to think in terms of straight-line evolution, for example. As mentioned earlier in this book, the accepted theory of evolution is highly simplistic. Footnote. See session 705 and appendix 12. End of footnote. Your species did not come from one particular source. You have many cousins, so to speak. Some traces of that lineage remain in your time. However, When you look, quote unquote, backward at the planet, you actually try to predict past behavior from the standpoint of the present. You do this personally in your intimate lives to some degree also, as you view your earlier days. You blot out events that do not fit your present concept of yourself. They literally become non existent as far as you are concerned. In such fashion, you block out aspects of your own reality and constantly, at least, cut down on your choices. Give us a moment. The species as you know it has within it intrinsically many abilities and characteristics that go unrecognized because you do not accept them as a part of your biological or spiritual heritage. Therefore, they become latent and invisible, practically speaking. The same applies individually when you deny yourselves the rich mixture of consciousness and experience that is available through a recognition of the manipulation of probable realities. You alter your experience in each instant, quite drastically. Each individual possesses far vaster opportunities for choice than are realized. You are denied tomorrow's wisdom only because you believe time is a closed system. Footnote. In Volume 1, see Note 4 for Session 680 and Note 2 for Session 688. End of footnote. It is true that you are subject to birth and death, yet within that framework, far greater dimensions of experience are possible than are usually experienced. You, underlined, are all counterparts of each other who are alive at any given Earth time. By really understanding this, you could come to terms with the ideas of brotherhood that religions have taught for so long. End of session. Thank you, Seth, I said after the sudden ending. Still in full trance, her eyes very dark, Jane stared at me. Then I watched the Seth personality begin to recede, to fade. Jane blinked a few times, and Seth was gone. 11:26 p.m. All right, that is indeed the end of that session. The Kindle app tells me that the next one will take about 38 minutes to get through. So that's not too bad. We might end up covering 3 sessions tonight then, possibly. All right, so let me just take a little breather here, and then we shall continue with the next session. So yeah, let me comment on things a little bit here too. Seth was talking about this idea that we basically create the past from the present, or recreate the past from the present. And if you saw, oh wow, this stream's been demonetized. Interesting. It'll probably be monetized again later though, knowing YouTube and how they seem to favor me. I guess I have a good belief in that area. But anyway, if you saw my recent stream from a few days ago, you know that that was a particular viewpoint that I sort of took issue with, this idea that we create the past from the present, because I see it so often used in what I would consider a rather destructive way, in perhaps even arguably an invalidating way. But the reason I don't have an issue with it when it comes from Seth is because, basically speaking, Seth is not doing that, at least not in my opinion. He's not using that spiritual truth to negate other just as valid and just as vital to integrate realities. He's simply pointing out the mechanics of things, rather than trying to say like, oh, well, since you only create the past from the present, then you might as well not focus on all of that repressed trauma because you're just recreating it. Seth isn't really saying stuff like that. I mean, sometimes he might allude to some things that could be sort of read as in that direction, I suppose. But one of Seth's strongest points that he continually makes throughout his books is this idea that your beliefs form reality, and that beliefs need to be analyzed. They need to be considered very deeply, especially negative beliefs. Negative beliefs need to be explored and hopefully changed to positive beliefs once you have discovered, why you have bought into those negative beliefs. Now, that is a form, in my strong opinion, of shadow work. It's getting you in touch with the depths of your psyche, and even, yes, the negative depths, and Seth advises that. And so My argument is that Seth is advising shadow work in his own way. So again, I have to say, I've got little to no problem with Seth's philosophy, I guess. But anyway, I'm going to grab a tissue real quick, so I will be right back. One moment. All right, I have returned. Also, thank you so much, whoever just liked the broadcast a little bit ago. I see that there. I do appreciate it. So yes, this next session is the one for which this stream is named or titled, where the idea of the end of the world is talked about, specifically the end of the world in connection with probabilities, according to what I saw in the table of contents. All right. Hang on one moment. Why do I keep getting notifications about Saturn's moon and its tiger stripes? It's actually quite amusing. I study astrology, and I guess the Google algorithm thinks that takes that to mean that I'm interested in astronomy. It's like, well, I'm not disinterested in astronomy. It's fairly interesting, I guess. But my real interest is astrology. But I just think that's funny how Google misinterprets that. Anyway, now let us continue with session 742, April 16th, 1975, 9:29 p.m. Wednesday. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. Dictation. The whole idea of probable realities seems strange or esoteric only because you are not used to following your own thought processes. You shut them off anytime they do not conform to current beliefs about the nature of the self or about reality in general. The deepest meanings of probabilities lie, however, precisely in their psychological import. Pause. You have become so hypnotized by one level kind of thought that anything else seems impractical. You concentrate upon those decisions that you make and disregard the processes involved. This has been carried to an extreme, you see. Often you are so disconnected from those inner workings that your own decisions then appear to come from someplace else. You may be convinced that events happen underlined to you and are beyond your control, simply because you are so out of touch with yourself that you never catch the moments of your own decisions. Then you feel as if you are the pawns of fate, and the idea of probable action seems like the sheerest nonsense. Each event seems inevitable. If this attitude is carried to excessive lengths, then it even appears that you have no hand at all in the making of your own reality. You will always feel yourself a victim. Wow, this is some really key stuff here. Then you feel as if you are the pawns of fate, and the idea of probable action seems like the sheerest nonsense. Each event seems inevitable, etc., etc. The unknown reality is your psychic, spiritual, and psychological one, and from it your physical experience springs. Footnote. This is a good place to insert these excerpts from the session Seth gave for ESP class on February 16th, 1971, 3 years before starting Unknown Reality. While it leads to a number of questions, his material still sums up certain important meanings that lie behind or within the overall concept of probable realities. Quote, "Now I am going to say good evening shortly, but remember, you call this your universe and your reality, and it is indeed, for you form it. Within you also is the knowledge of other great experiments that are being tried, just as other probable systems are aware of the experiments you are involved with. I am speaking in your terms only, which means that to some extent I am hedging, but other civilizations have gone your route. Some have failed, but the inhabitants of some Earths have succeeded very well. As you think of it, your future is not set. You can follow any road you choose, but until you realize that as individuals, you each form your own personal life and have a part in the mass creation of reality, there is much learning ahead for you. This is a lesson you are meant to fully understand within physical reality. You are meant to judge physical reality. You are meant to realize that it is a materialization of your thoughts and feelings and images, that the inner self forms that world. In your terms, you cannot be allowed to go into other dimensions until you have learned the great power of your thoughts and subjective feelings. So even when you think you destroy nothing. And when you think you kill nothing. When you imagine that you can annihilate a reality, underlined, you can only assault it as you know it. The reality itself will continue to exist. Because you cannot follow a thought, you wonder where it has gone. Has it fallen off some invisible cliff in your mind? But because you can no longer hold that thought in consciousness does not mean it no longer exists, that it does not have a reality of its own, for it does indeed. And if a world escapes you, if you cannot follow it and think it has been destroyed, then the same thing applies to the world as to the thought. It continues to live. Now, what I have said should inspire questions within you." End quote. Much in these passages fits in with the material I've presented in Appendix 12 on the reasons behind the pain and suffering in the world. Early in that appendix, then, see the quotations from the 580th session for Chapter 20 of Seth Speaks, and from the 634th session for Chapter 8 of Personal Reality. End of footnote. That inner, all-pervasive existence becomes known to the extent that you grow more responsive to your own inner environment. This does not mean that you become entirely self-centered, blind to the rest of the world. It does not mean that you must meditate for hours or study your own thought processes with such vigor that you ignore other activities. It simply means that you are underlined aware of your own life as clearly as possible, in touch with your thought processes, aware of them but without overdue concern or over-analysis. They are as much a part of your inner environment as trees are of your exterior world. There are different species of selves in the same fashion. There are different species of worlds. New paragraph, as Seth often declares. When you identify with only one particular level of your thought processes, however, the others, when you sense them, appear alien. You begin to feel threatened, determined to uphold your old ideas of selfhood. Plants grow many leaves. One leaf does not threaten the existence of others, and the plant is not jealous of its own foliage. So there is no need to protect your own individuality because it may send out other shoots into probable realities. This is simply the self growing in different directions, spreading its seeds. Pause at 9:52, eyes closed. Joseph and Rupert have moved into a quote-unquote new house. Here we go with this house stuff again. Our new Hill house is really 21 years old. It seems new to Jane and me, though, and to Seth, too, we notice. Calling it new is a pretty convenient way for us to distinguish it from the much older apartment house we vacated last month. Actually, however, we're using the word new to indicate our present physical and psychological states. In that sense, if the house we've just moved into was physically older than the one we left behind, I suppose we'd still call it new. End of footnote. In so doing, they have traveled through probabilities, as each of my readers has under similar circumstances. Long pause. They identify with the selves who moved into the new, quote-unquote, Hill house. In a sense, they are different people now than they were when unknown reality was begun, some 14 months ago. However, many of my readers are also different people now than they were when they began to read this work. Let us go back approximately 2 months in your time. Rupert and Joseph were looking for a house. They had already seen one on the inside, as mentioned earlier in Unknown Reality. Footnote. See the notes at the start of the 735th session for February 3rd, 1975. End of footnote. This manuscript, for that matter, was begun precisely at the point in time that Rupert's and Joseph's latest adventure with Probabilities began. 2 months ago, however, they were attracted to, quote, the Foster Avenue house, end quote, as they called it. Change the name if you want to. They drove past it often and went inside. Rupert imagined his classes being held there. Imaginatively, both Rupert and Joseph saw themselves living there, and a certain amount of psychic energy was projected into that house. In a probable reality, a Rupert and a Joseph now live there. In the world that you recognize as official, however, they moved into the Hill House. To some extent, both of them are aware of the inner processes involved in the final decision. I do not mean that they are simply familiar with the exterior thought processes involved, such as, quote, the Hill House is better constructed, or it has a fine view. I am speaking of deeper mechanisms of consideration, pause, in which correlations are made between interior and exterior realities, pause. It is obvious that when you move from one place to another, you make an alteration in space, but you alter time as well, and you set into motion a certain psychological impetus that reaches out to affect everyone you know. Long pause. When a house is vacant, all of the people in the neighborhood send out their own messages. To a certain extent, any given inhabited area forms its own quote-unquote entity. This applies to the smallest neighborhood and to the greatest nation. Footnote. See Note 1 for Session 739 and Note 11 for Session 740. End of footnote. Such messages are often encountered in the dream state. Empty houses are underlined psychic vacancies that yearn to be filled. When you move into other portions of your own selfhood. Footnote. I borrowed liberally from these very perceptive lines of Seth's in order to conclude the epilogue for Volume 1 of Unknown Reality. End of footnote. Take your break. 10:11. I've been doing this book for so long by now, Jane commented, that I don't know if it's a great big sprawling thing without any order or what. I've lost all track of whatever sense of continuity it's got, she amended. When I come out of trance, I don't know what the thing's all about. Out of habit, Jane, and consequently Seth, still talked about Unknown Reality as being one entity, even though just 5 days ago we learned from her editor that it would be published in 2 volumes. The tenor of Seth's material tonight led me to think that he was close to finishing Unknown Reality, but since Jane evidently didn't feel that way, I said nothing about it. Resume at 10:29. In fact, you move into new areas of the self all the time. The species is now entering such a phase, a period in which it will come more into its own. Mankind will be entering its own new house, then, but the physical changes will be the results of interior ones, and alterations in main lines of probabilities. Christian theology sees the end of the world in certain terms, with a grand God coming to reward the good and punish the wicked. Footnote. According to some Christian sects, all of this is to transpire at the parousia, or the anticipated second coming of Jesus Christ during the Last Judgment. In the Bible, see Daniel 7:13, Matthew 24, and so forth. End of footnote. But one moment. See if I can use this app to figure out how the hell you say that one word. Hang on. It's not letting me do it from there. Can I do it from here? Yeah, here we go. Parousia, I think. Parousia. Parousia. Christian theology, another term for second coming. Okay, well, there you have it. Parousia. Underlined, that system of belief allows for no other probability. Some see the end of the world coming as a great disaster, or envision man finally ruining his planet. Hang on, I have a comment to make here, but let me finish this paragraph first. Others see periods of peace and advance, and each probability will happen, quote unquote, somewhere. However, many of my readers or their offspring will be involved in a new dimension of selfhood in which consciousness is fully explored and the potentials of the soul uncovered, at least to some extent. So I guess I'm going to take a little bit of a risk here and get perhaps a bit controversial, but and I'm not wanting to offend the validity of anyone's path in life, but it's just very interesting to consider in light of what Seth is saying here about end of the world scenarios and probabilities and stuff like that, and the idea of system of beliefs or systems of belief being such a big factor in all of that. It's interesting to consider. There are some, how shall we say this, some rather fringe groups out there, some very fringe groups that believe that there will be some kind of end of the world manifesting as in some kind of grand takeover by an elite cabal, like the idea of a new world order conspiracy, that sort of conspiracy theory, which is toxically pervasive on the internet today. And again, I'm not wanting to offend anyone's the validity of anyone's chosen path through life and chosen areas of exploration, you do you and all that. I'm just saying, in the context of what Seth is saying here, having a belief in, say, the apocalypse or the parousia in Christian terms, or perhaps that there's going to be like a sort of like new world order takeover. The stream's already demonetized, so whatever. Is very problematic when we consider the idea that beliefs, if they don't literally form reality, at the very least have a very strong influence on reality. It's like the more you focus on things turning out that way, the more they could turn out that way in theory. And again, it's like, this is tricky territory, because it's like, well, if there are certain dark realities, then I agree they should be uncovered. Injustices should be dealt with. I'm all about that. And, we shouldn't just put our heads in the sand. But I think, I guess all I can say about that is I think we have to be very careful to discern what is, for all intents and purposes, quote unquote, objective reality, and what is simply belief that has yet to actually become reality. Because if we have a lot of negative beliefs about what things are and or what things will be, well, if those beliefs are just beliefs, if they haven't actually really manifested into anything yet, then they're highly problematic. They're highly problematic. So I don't know, undoubtedly everyone will make up their own minds about that, I guess. So continuing on, I think that arm needs a bit of a break. Human capabilities will be seen as what they are, and a great new period of development will occur, in which all concepts of selfhood and reality will be literally seen as, quote unquote, primitive superstition. The species will actually move into a new kind of selfhood. That's interesting. Wait, so Seth is literally talking about here. Wait a minute, back up. Many of my readers or their offspring will be involved in a new dimension of selfhood in which consciousness is fully explored at the potentials of the soul uncovered, at least to some extent. Human capabilities will be seen as what they are, and a great new period of development will occur, in which all concepts of selfhood and reality will be literally seen as primitive superstition. species will actually move into a new kind of selfhood. Wait, this is okay. We're getting into some interesting stuff here. What is this? Theories of probabilities will be seen as practical, workable psychological facts, giving leeway and freedom to the individual, who will no longer feel underlined at the mercy of external events, but will realize instead that he or she is their initiator. And it seems like more and more people are realizing that these days, albeit in a rather sort of fucked up way, but still, I guess in a way, you could argue it's progress. Now, you squeeze the great fruit of your selfhood into a tiny, uneasy pulp, unaware of the sweetness of its juices or the variety of its seasons. You look at the outsides of yourselves as if a peach were aware only of its skin. In the reality I foresee, however, people will become familiar with far greater aspects of themselves and bring these into actualization. They will be in touch with their own decisions as they make them. If they become ill, they will do so knowing they choose the condition in order to emphasize certain areas of development or to minimize others. They will be aware of their options, consciously. The great strength and resiliency of the body will be much better understood, not because medical science makes spectacular discoveries, though it will, but because the mind's alliance with the body will be seen more clearly. Interesting. I wonder if Seth is going to give us like an approximation of when this is most likely to happen. I don't know. Let's see. In this probability of which I speak, the species will begin to encounter the great challenge inherent in fulfilling the vast, underlined, untouched, forcefully underlined potential of the human body and mind. Wait, so the species will begin to encounter the great challenge inherent in fulfilling the vast, untouched potential of the human body and mind. Interesting. Long pause. In that probable reality, to which each of you can belong to some extent, each person will recognize his or her inherent power of action and decision, and feel an individual sense of belonging with the physical world that springs up in response to individual desire and belief. Footnote. Naturally, Seth's discussion since break reflects much of his material throughout personal reality. Then in Volume 1, see his comments just before 1126 for session 687. Quote, I underlined am saying that the individual self must become consciously aware of underlined far more reality. Your species is in a time of change. There are potentials within the body's mechanisms, in your terms, not as yet used. Developed, they can immeasurably enrich the species. If some changes are not made, the species as such will not endure. End quote. End of footnote. 10:59. Give us a moment. Jane, in trance, lit a cigarette. Your ideas of Atlantis are underlined partially composed of underlined future memories. They are psychic yearnings toward the ideal civilization, patterns within the psyche, even as each fetus has within it the picture of its own most ideal fulfillment toward which it grows. Atlantis is a land that you want to inhabit, appearing in your literature, your dreams, and your fantasies, serving as an impetus for development. Footnote. See Appendix 14. End of footnote. It underlined is real and valid. In your terms, it is not quote unquote yet physical fact, but in some ways it is more real than any physical fact, for it is a psychic blueprint. Footnote. See Note 3 for session 740. End of footnote. That's weird, because I happen to recall that in Seth Speaks, Seth said that, well, I'm pretty sure he said anyway, I'm almost certain that he said that Atlantis was a civilization in our probable past or whatever, and was describing what it was like during that time. But I'm sure, given what Seth's overall thesis is, that both realities could be just as real and valid, that Atlantis, in a sense, exists both in our past and in our future. It carries also, however, the imprint of your fears, for the tales say that Atlantis was destroyed. You place it in your past while it exists in your future. Not the destruction alone, but the entire pattern seen through the framework of your beliefs. Beside this, however, many civilizations have come and gone in underlined somewhat the same manner, and the quote-unquote myth of Atlantis is based underlined somewhat then on physical fact in your terms. Footnote. In Volume 1, quotations from Seth's material just given on Atlantis are presented in Note 3 for Session 702. End of footnote. The species then moves into its own new houses. Atlantis is the story of a future probability projected backward into an apparent past. Give us a moment. Your planet, as you know it, is a certain kind of focus point for consciousness. At your level, you think it is divided into areas of land and water, continents and oceans, islands and peninsulas, cities and woods, because that is all you perceive. Your consciousness is tuned into frequencies of perception that give you that impression. A cat's world, or an insect's, or a plant's, are each far different, yet equally valid. As simply as I can explain it, your planet is also quote-unquote divided into time and probability areas, period. So many civilizations exist at once, then, and there are certain bleed-throughs. In your terms, some civilizations are real and perceivable, and some are not. Loudly. End of session. It is a good place to end, and to start the next one. All right. I bid you a fond good evening. Thank you, Seth. Loudly and with amusement. I have plenty of comments about your personal situations, but I wanted to get back into the book first. Oh, very good. Thank you, and good night. End at 11:10 p.m. Jane's trance had been excellent. You don't have to put this in, she said, but I feel like I do every once in a while. I really let it out. I feel relieved and ready to collapse. I don't know why, but I sometimes think that it's a tremendous strain to do this, have these sessions and so forth, but I'm determined to explore this reality as much as I can to get all I can out of it. Then sometimes I think there's nothing to it. Everyone has their hassles, so why should I have any more or less? I really think I have less trouble than a lot of people. End quote. I read to Jane the few paragraphs of material Seth had given on Atlantis. Both of us thought it quite sensible, although it brought up questions I'll get to shortly. I'll have to admit that we cringe a bit when Seth talks about cultish concepts like Atlantis. We always think that such beliefs, while serving a variety of quite legitimate creative and psychic purposes, are very likely to be more mythic than physically factual. The word physically is important here. From these remarks, it's easy to see that we feel much more comfortable with the ideas about Atlantis than advanced in this session. Wait, did I read that properly? From these remarks, it's easy to see that we feel, much more comfortable with the ideas about Atlantis and Seth advanced in this session. Quote, he's got more on it too, end quote, Jane said now, but she didn't go back into trance. The questions I referred to concern the fact that once in the Seth material and 9 times in Seth Speaks, by my count, Seth spoke of Atlantis as being in our historical past. There you go, just as I mentioned a little bit ago. He did so this evening also, of course, when he remarked at 10:59 that our, quote, ideas of Atlantis are underlined partially composed of underlined future memories, end quote, thus leaving room for past manifestations. Seth's theory of simultaneous time, which can encompass the notion of future probabilities projected backward into an apparent past, for instance, leaves great leeway for the interpretation of events or questions, however. It makes the idea of contradiction posed by an Atlantis in the past and one in the future too simple as an explanation. At any given quote-unquote time, depending on whatever information he's given previously, Jane could just as easily quote Seth as placing Atlantis in our historic past, or in a probable past, present, or future, or all 4 quote-unquote places at once, for that matter. Any or all of these views would simply be repatterning other dimensions of time from our quote-unquote present point of power. Questions of reincarnation enter in also. Seth has connected himself with Atlantis only once, but he did so very definitely. From the 588th session for chapter 22 of Seth Speaks, quote, I was born in Atlantis, end quote. Jane and I felt those same uneasy twinges then, too, but chose not to explore them at that time. After this evening's session, however, we decided we'd like to know why, in Seth's view, Atlantis had moved from its long, if uneasy residence in our quote-unquote historical past forward into a future probable reality. We resolved to ask him to explain, but strangely enough, I note later, a month passed before we got around to a session on the subject. By then, Seth had been through with unknown reality for 3 weeks. Now I refer the reader to note 11 for quotations from the session, the 747th in question. Okay, and for some reason, note 11 is not directly linked to, but we can take a look here. Let's see, how long is it? Okay, fairly long note, but let's get to it then. Note 11. I found it quite difficult to extract from the 747th session the material I wanted for this note on Atlantis. So interwound is it with closely related information on early man and animal kingdoms, the expanding universe theory, archaeology, Jane's other work, all that is, and so forth. Some of those topics have been discussed in earlier sessions or notes, but no such references are given here, nor is any new backup material offered. Jane and I regard Seth's latest delivery on Atlantis as still being only a partial explanation of the whole question of myth and fantasy versus quote-unquote physical fact, no matter what time schemes may be involved. We intend to explore it all as much as we can in quote-unquote future work. From session 747 for May 14th, 1975, quote, Atlantis. First of all, take it for granted, as you do, that your ideas about the age of the Earth are erroneous. There were intelligent human beings far earlier than is supposed, and because you assume a one-line kind of progression from an ape-like creature to man, you ignore any evidence that shows to the contrary. There were highly developed human beings with elaborate civilizations existing simultaneously with what you might call animal kingdoms, that is, more or less organized primeval animal tribes, possessing their own kinds of quote-unquote primitive cultures. Those animal kingdoms, some of them, utilized tools. Their senses were extremely acute. Their quote-unquote cultures dealt with a kind of transmission of knowledge that made a highly complicated vocabulary unnecessary. Those species did not vie for domination of the Earth, but simply shared the same general environment with the more sophisticated groupings beyond their own perimeters. There were many highly technical human cultures, but in your terms, not on a global scale. The legend of Atlantis is actually based upon several such civilizations. No underlined particular civilization is the basis, however. Apart from that, the legend as picked up, so to speak, by Plato, see Appendix 14, was a precognition of the future probability, an image of an inner civilization of the mind actually projected outward into the future, where it would be used as a blueprint, the lost grandeur, as, in other terms, Eden became the lost garden of paradise. Rubert has implied in his novel, The Education of Oversoul 7, that some archaeological discoveries about the underlined past, are not discovered in your present because they do not exist, underlined, yet. Now, such concepts are difficult to explain in my kind of prose and in your language, but in certain terms, the ruins of Atlantis have not been found, underlined, because they have not been placed in your past yet from the future. Now, the future is probable. However, in your terms, there are ruins of the civilizations that served as the quote-unquote concrete basis for the one Atlantean legend. Those civilizations were scattered. The so-called ruins would not be found in any one place as expected, therefore. There are some beneath the Aegean Sea, and some beneath an offshoot of the Atlantic, and some beneath the Arctic, for the world had a different shape. In far greater terms, louder, humorously, underlined, at the risk of repeating myself, time is simultaneous, so those civilizations exist along with your own. Your methods of dating the age of the Earth are very misleading. Underlined, in your terms, From your present, you quote unquote plant images, tales, legends, quote unquote, at any given time that underlined seem to come from the past, but are actually like ghost images from the future for you to follow or disregard as you choose. Atlantis and the Garden of Eden are the same in that regard. When you think that perhaps your species came from another planetary system in time terms, then of course you are still dealing with old concepts. In your usual terms of thinking, underlined, the Earth does not exist at all, emphatically. Not if you are considering it as a chunk of matter occupying a certain position in a physical cosmos. It is underlined really futile to question whether the universe came from a underlined big boom, again emphatically, humorously, or is constantly expanding, though in those terms I've said it continually expands as an idea or a dream does. I am not saying the universe does not exist, only that it does not exist in the underlined way that it seems to you. By itself, with a smile, almost an outright laugh, the truth of the matter is far more spectacular. All that is creates its reality as it goes along. Each world has its own impetus, yet all are ultimately connected. The true dimensions of a divine creativity would be underlined unendurable for any one consciousness of whatever import, and so that splendor is infinitely dimensionalized, most intensely throughout. Worlds spiraling outward with each quote unquote moment of a cosmic breath, with the separation of worlds a necessity, and with individual and mass comprehension underlined always growing at such a rate that all that is multiplies itself at microseconds, building both past and futures and other timescales you do not recognize. Each is a reality in itself, with its own potentials, and with no individual consciousness, however minute, ever lost. In that kind of framework, how can I explain an Atlantis? It exists both in your past and future, a probable world that some of you will choose from a model placed in the past of your future, partially based upon fact in your terms, but with its greatest validity lying in its possibilities. End quote, end of note, and indeed the end of that session. So here's what we're going to do. We're only an hour and 7 minutes in, so I can easily read another session, especially since it's only 19 minutes according to the Kindle app. So I'm going to take like a 1 minute break and then we shall resume. So 1 minute. All right, so I've returned. So, allow me to make some observations before we resume with the next session. First of all, let's see here. The moon, as I'm speaking here live at 8:22 p.m., just went void of course at 8:13 p.m., only 9 minutes ago. So, isn't that interesting? You know what the moon being void of course is good for, among other things? Ending things. So I wonder if we can get through the next session, could we possibly also perhaps just finish the main part of the book tonight? I don't know. Maybe that's what is destined to happen in tonight's session. Let's take a look here, or in tonight's stream, I guess I should say. Let's take a look here at these final 2 sessions of the main part of the book. Session 743, You Are the Unknown Reality. Session 744, This Book and Probable One's Seth's Reality. Okay, so I mean, we know that this next session is a short one, so perhaps we can just, get through the rest of it tonight. We shall see. Let me check on one other thing here, and then we shall continue. One moment, please. All right, so everything's looking good. Let's go ahead and proceed. Session 743, April 21st, 1975, 9:46 p.m., Monday. I read the last part of Wednesday's session to Jane from my notes. Quote, I've got the nostalgic, uneasy feeling that he's going to wind up the book soon, she said, especially after listening to that material just before the Atlanta stuff. I didn't feel that way when I had the session, but I do now. I've said it before, I know, but this book started when we were thinking of moving, and now we're settled in a new place, so that makes a good time to end it, end quote. Jane paused. She still habitually referred to Unknown Reality as a 1-volume work, even as Seth himself did in the session this evening, despite a decision made 10 days ago to publish it in 2 volumes. I feel sort of sorry, she continued, because here the sessions will stop again just after we got back into them. You'll need time to finish the notes and do all that typing, end quote. Footnote. A note added 4 months later. Jane needn't have worried. The sessions didn't come to a halt after all. With the arrival of warmer weather, we did take an occasional break from psychic work, but for the most part, the sessions were held regularly, even though Seth was through with Unknown Reality. Some of them were private, but Seth also covered a number of interesting topics from a more general nature, material we'd like to see published eventually. His comments in the 750th session as to why Unknown Reality was written are quoted in the introductory notes for Volume 1. We finally rested from the sessions for most of July, although Jane continued working on her psychic politics, among other projects. Then, in the 752nd session for July 28th, 1975, Seth plunged into his next book, The Nature of the Psyche, Its Human Expression. He's well into it at this writing, and as Jane and I have planned things, the notes for it will be very short. It should be published a few months after this present volume is issued. End of footnote. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. Dictation. No book entitled The Unknown Reality can hope to make that reality entirely known. It remains nebulous because it is consciously unrealized. The best I can do is to point out areas that have been relatively invisible to help you explore, actually, different facets of your own consciousness. Footnote. I ended up by using Seth's opening passages here, plus a couple of later ones from the session in the notes in introducing Volume 1. Wait, why does this sentence not make sense to me? I ended up by using Seth's opening passages here, plus a couple of later ones from the session in the notes introducing Volume 1. Weird, I don't know. Anyway, end of footnote. To some extent, this book has been written to help you exercise your own intuitive and mental capacities from a different viewpoint. In a way, it is meant to familiarize you with elements of your own reality of which you may have been unaware, and to introduce you to certain subjective states of mind that are automatically aroused because of the manner in which the book was produced. Period. Besides this, however, it contains what you may call underlined cues that automatically open up greater levels of your own awareness, and hence bring into your conscious life some recognition of the unknown reality in which you also have your being. The subject matter itself entices your imagination. That intuitive faculty will then illuminate the intellect so that it learns to question in a broader, more exciting and underlined productive manner than perhaps it did before. I am well aware that the book raises many more questions than it presents answers for, and this has been my intent. The unknown reality will become known to the extent that you form new questions and forget the old frameworks in which answers and myths were automatically given in response. If this book, quote unquote, works, then many old questions will be seen as relatively meaningless, formed not after any intimate encounter with basic issues, but in response to old dogmas. The quote unquote proper questions about the unknown reality will automatically bring more of it into your experience. Give us a moment. Many of the questions you think were underlined not answered in this book, however, underlined have been answered, but from a different angle, the answers presented in such a way that they will entice you to further creative thought. Underlined, you are the unknown reality, to the extent that you do not recognize, realize, or experience the many facets of your own being. As always, I say that the answers lie within yourself, not in the exterior world. 1009. Clues may indeed be found there, however, because the exterior conditions mirror so perfectly your inner, individual, and mass experience. Give us a moment. This book itself, because of the method of its production, is an excellent example of the unknown reality becoming, if not quote-unquote known, then recognized. Do not look for neat answers or tidy solutions, for when you do, your explanations and theories will always be too small. There is always an unknown reality to some extent, for the miracle of your being works outside of the kind of explanations that you so often seem to require. Your ready answers end up limiting your own experience because you try to fit your subjective behavior into the cramped boot of preconceived ideas. Your experience creates new questions in the same way that a painter creates new paintings. Long pause. The unknown reality, many of you, I know, would like to find in this book answers pertaining to Atlantis, the Bermuda Triangle, UFOs, and many other such questions. Footnote. See Appendix 20 for Volume 2. End of footnote. Those matters certainly seem pertinent in the framework of your experience and beliefs. You already have a great variety of explanations offered. Writers in many fields have produced books about such topics. By far the greater questions, however, are those pertaining to the unknown reality of the psyche, and those that relate to the kind of being who perceives in one way or another an Atlantis, a Bermuda Triangle, a UFO. For in greater terms, until you ask deeper questions about underlined yourselves, these other experiences will remain mysterious. You cannot understand perceived events unless you understand who perceives them. You must learn more about the slant of your own consciousness before you are in a position to ask underlined, truly pertinent questions about the reality that you perceive. This reminds me of how there seemed to be, I think anyway, a number of people who subscribe to my channel because of other factors that still expect this, even well over a year later, to be a paranormal themed channel. And it makes me wonder if maybe it would perhaps be productive in some sense to do like a regular reading in streams of a book on like UFOs or something of that sort that Seth just mentioned, because I could maybe do that at some point. I wonder if I should. It would be maybe that would be a nice compromise. It would be like a hang on, I'm going to put my tablet down for a bit and rest my arm. It would be like maybe a way to satisfy those who seem to continue to this day to expect paranormal related material from this channel, but also like that would just be, you know, one type of thing that I did, one stream that I did regularly, and then I'd have all my other content. So maybe, I don't know, I might do something like that at some point. Who knows? I'll have to think about it. I'm not going to make the decision now, though. That's for damn sure, because the moon is currently void of course, and you don't want to make important decisions while the moon is void of course. At least that is what I believe. You know, everyone else will make up their own mind. I hope I didn't just hear like another bug in here. I had to remove one from this room earlier. I don't know if that's supposed to be Mercury in my third house, septiling my natal Mercury or what, but you know, those are some strange otherworldly events that I don't want. Anyway, let us continue. (10:23). As Seth, Jane paused during an intent delivery. Are your fingers tired? No, I said. At the same time, I was thinking as I wrote that Seth's sentence above, you cannot understand perceived events unless you understand who perceives them, embodied one of his best ideas in unknown reality. Give us a moment, then. Still in trance, Jane took a sip of wine and lit a cigarette. There are many who will give you answers to such questions. The answers will be couched in a framework of beliefs that you have held individually and collectively for some time. In this book, I am purposely trying to lead you into a larger, more expansive way of looking at yourself and the world in which you live. When I consider those, Atlantis, UFOs, and so forth, and other such matters, it will be from a much different perspective. By then you, my readers, will be familiar enough with the unknown reality to understand answers given in a different context, period. This book had no chapters in order to further disrupt your accepted notions of what a book should be. There are different kinds of organizations present, however, and in any given section of the book, several levels of consciousness are appealed to at once, intently. The threads of the work are interwoven so that various portions of your consciousness are sent out, so to speak, on separate journeys of thought and imagination. Yet these side trips are also related. They intertwine not only through the psychic organization that I have given to unknown reality, but because of the great uniting nature within the consciousness of each reader. And now, however many decades later, they intertwine, I suppose, through my YouTube channel as well. Different people discovering different parts of the book at different times through different avenues, I guess, vis-a-vis the YouTube algorithm and all that. Wow, I am deeply honored to play some small part of this probable reality. or these multiple realities, I suppose. Why is the video getting choppy on my end? I hope we don't get disconnected, you gods. I hope we stay connected. All right, where were we? Again, Rupert and Joseph have moved to a new place. Each reader has also journeyed to a new position within the psyche, however. This book is a bridge between realities. Reading it, each person sets out upon a psychic pilgrimage through the unknown realities of his or her own consciousness and experience. No one can predict the destination. Pause. I am a part of your unknown reality, and you are a part of mine. To some extent, in these pages, our realities meet. To the extent that you do not know yourself, you do not know your world. To the extent that you do not know yourself, you do not know your husband or wife or mother and father. To the extent that you do not know yourself, you do not know what God is. To the extent that you do not know yourself, you do not know what nature is. The unknown reality exists to the extent that you do not travel joyfully through the intimate lands of the psyche, to the extent that you do not directly experience your life as original, forcefully, but accept labels put on it by others. Thank you for the like, whoever just gave that. I appreciate it. The unknown reality exists as a challenge, an exciting endeavor, as each individual becomes consciously aware of intimate subjective feeling. Do not overlay the personal daily aspects of your life with preconceived ideas about who you are, what you are, where you are, why you are. Become aware of the original nature of any given moment as it exists for you. Pause. Forget what you have been told about time and space. Refuse to accept ideas that limit the dimensions of your own natural being. Again, the unknown reality is what you are. And louder, end of dictation, underlined, end of book. Take a break. 10:50. Jane was soon out of trance, but she had a very, very long face. That was an excellent dissertation, I said. I'd rather be starting a book than ending one, I guess. She sat quietly. I thought she wanted to cry, but wouldn't let herself do so. I do have a couple of questions, I continued. We can talk about them before break ends. I'd like to add them to the book material tonight, along with Seth's answers, that is. For the moment, though, we ate cookies and indulged in small talk. I could see that Jane was not only sad that the long project was finished for her, but uneasy too. She was suddenly set loose, released from a framework that had come to be very familiar over the last 14.5 months. Not that her new freedom hadn't been expected, but she's so creative that as soon as she is through with one undertaking, she's ready to launch into another. And this applies even though she's been working on psychic politics outside of this framework. That's her focus in life, and mine too. The full commitment to artistic production. I'd often heard her comment about being in a kind of limbo between works. Her abilities demand use and release. As Jane moved about, I wrote out my 2 questions for Seth while thinking of a third. 1. What do you think about this work being published in 2 volumes? 2. In our terms of time, what were some of your other activities in other realities while you were giving unknown reality through Jane for well over a year? 3. I suppose it's quite evident why you finished unknown reality right after we moved into our quote-unquote new house. But will you reassure Jane by commenting on this and on future works? When Jane sat down again, I read the questions to her. Our cat, Willie, jumped up into her lap. I'm still appalled, she said dejectedly. Here my part in the thing is done, but you've got to live with it for a long time yet while you do the notes and typing. I wish there was some way each book could be turned into print instantly, so that we could go on to the next one. I can't help it. Every time Seth finishes a book, I feel like crying. And why not? It's a perfectly natural reaction, I said. But an interesting point came out as we talked. Jane doesn't experience that strong nostalgia when she finishes one of her quote-unquote own books. Well, I'm just waiting now, she said finally. I can feel session material there, but I don't know what it'll be about. I'm just waiting until I get over the shock. Resume at 11:27, which was Seth's way of leading us into other than book material. For a little while, he discussed Jane's politics, our relationship with others through the mail and by telephone, and a different kind of quote-unquote inner listening that we'd become involved in. Then he wound up the evening's work with a remark that I took to be a reference to my third question. I bid you then a fond good evening for now, from my unknown reality to yours. You can have all the books that you want, when you want them, and at your own pacing. Thank you, Seth. Good night. 11:44 p.m. And so, even though Seth had declared the end of unknown reality this evening, it will still include at least part of the next session. Okay, yes, I guess indeed it will. The app says that the next session will take 26 minutes to read, and so I guess we'll go through that tonight as well, and then the main part of the book will be finished, and then we'll only have appendix material in subsequent weeks, subsequent streams to get through. Wow, pretty amazing. Approaching the end, and again, I love how we're ending it during the void of course moon, and how the moon literally just went void of course like half an hour ago. All right, so let us now proceed with session 744, April 23rd, 1975, 9:33 p.m., Wednesday. Yesterday, Jane received from her publisher the galley proofs for her book of poetry, Dialogues of the Soul and Mortal Self in Time. Footnote. A note added later in the year. Dialogues was published by Prentice Hall in September 1975. End of footnote. The story of that work's creation is interwound throughout personal reality. I read to Jane again the 3 questions I noted down for Seth during break in Monday's session. As I suspected he might do, Seth began this evening's session by dealing with the second one. Not all of his material tonight is given over to questions, however. Much of the rest of it, covering matters other than those relating to unknown reality, is deleted. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. Now, in a way, it is quite difficult to tell you what I have been doing with, underlined, my time, humorously emphatic, while I have been involved in the production of unknown reality, and therefore, to some extent at least, inclined toward your time. Footnote. See the material on Seth's concept of simultaneous time as given in the concluding notes for session 724. Included are some very intriguing excerpts from the 14th session, which was held over 11 years ago. Seth, quote, while I am not affected by time on your plane, I am affected by something resembling time on my plane. Underlined, it is therefore still a reality of some kind to me. End quote. In this case, I added the underline myself for emphasis. To Seth's remarks in that early session, I'd now like to add what he said a decade later in our time. From the 514th session for Chapter 2 of Seth Speaks, quote, consciousness is not dependent upon form, as I have said, and yet it always seeks to create form. We do not exist in any time framework as you know it. Minutes, hours, or years have lost both their meaning and their fascination. We are quite aware of the time situations within other systems, however, and we must take them into account in our communications. Otherwise, what we say would not be understood. End quote. End of footnote. In a manner of speaking, your experience, practical reality is made up of events that seem underlined entire to you, or relatively complete, while from my dimension it is apparent that your recognized events are simply portions of larger ones. I move naturally, then, in a realm of greater dimensionalized events. In your terms, I see not only greater chunks of time than you do, but I can to some considerable extent view the probable actualizations of events and times. Now, an artist does the same thing in different terms when he or she imagines the probable versions that a painting or a book or a sculpture, for example, might take. Pause. The artist does not usually understand, however, that those probable art productions do literally exist. He perceives only the final, physically chosen work. Speaking simply, some of us are able to hold intact the nature of our own identities while following patterns of probable realities in which we also play a part. In your reality, the unknown reality we have just finished is the only version of that manuscript. Instead, it is, of course, the only version you underlined recognize. When we are working on such a project here, in your reality, we are working on probable books also, and those are as real as your official one. In ways too difficult to explain now, your probabilities are connected by certain themes, intents, purposes. Some of these appear as subsidiary interests in your own lives, for example. Others may well be recognized by you as prime concerns, and still others may be so latent that you are unaware of them. So we have been working on a probable unknown reality. In fact, on many probable unknown realities. Not mere versions, but variations. In one reality, of course, the work was finished at the Foster Avenue house in Elmira, New York. In another, it was finished in Sayre, Pennsylvania. Now, that is what I have been doing as far as underlined your reality is concerned, that is, in my relationship with you. It is a multidimensional version of what Rupert does in simple terms when he writes a book of his own. Footnote. Following Seth's material in these paragraphs, then, there are, of course, a number of other Janes and Robs busily living out their lives in a cluster of associated probable realities. And all of those Janes and Robs are just as real to Seth as we are. I've had the thought before. It's a somewhat chastening one, I said to Jane, joking, since it means that from Seth's viewpoint, we could be just two more individuals. All sorts of interesting questions arise. Perhaps Seth likes some of those other versions of ourselves more than he does us. I didn't ask him if I was right, though. It might even be that his favorite Jane inhabits one probable reality, his favorite Rob another. How does Seth tell all of us apart? What age differences are there among us? In which reality did we produce the quote-unquote best version of unknown reality? The worst? Moreover, what do all of those other Janes and Robs think of their Seths? And so on. End of footnote. I've also helped in the construction, so to speak, of Rupert's psychic library, and I hope that he will be able to meet me there, in surroundings in which he feels confident and at home, and yet on neutral ground. Footnote. Jane describes in Chapter 1 of Politics the onset of her ability to perceive her psychic library. For library material in Volume 2 of Unknown Reality, see the notes at the start of session 714 and Seth's dictation for session 715. End of footnote. Smiling. He does not want my underlined apparition, you might say, to intrude upon a physical living room, particularly, underlined, yet he wants to meet me, much louder, leaning forward, underlined, in an out-of-the-way place. Footnote. Jane is yet to see Seth's apparition, however, or to meet him in her library or any other, quote-unquote, out-of-the-way place. In Note 2 for Appendix 11 in Volume 1, I refer to the time she set out to, quote-unquote, find Seth. End of footnote. Now that is a sensible arrangement. He is the one who has to deal primarily with the practical aspects of our relationship, and in the business of translating my reality into your world. Long pause at 9:56. I quite approve, for in greater terms, I do not belong in your living room in that particular fashion. My reality is far more apparent than any apparitions. Rupert does well because he explores so cleverly and keeps his strands of reality in good order. Footnote. Seth spoke of strands of reality here, we think, because today Jane had been going over her material on the stages of consciousness and strands of consciousness for chapters 24 and 25, respectively, of Politics. End of footnote. Long pause at 10:01. Others have indeed sensed me, Sue Watkins, for example, But the relationship there is far different, and it is important for Rupert that he have clear-cut areas, which I respect. Footnote. In session 594 for the appendix of Seth Speaks, see Sue's material on how she sensed Jane's and Seth's quote-unquote speeds, as well as her own. End of footnote. Any such appearances, by the way, would also add too much superstitious nonsense. On the other hand, there is much for Rupert to learn about my reality. Until he understood the inward order of events, he would not be able to meet me there, so the library can serve us both in that regard. Footnote. Appendix 18 for Volume 2 of Unknown Reality contains much material, quote, on the complex relationships involving Jane Rupert Seth and also Rob Joseph, end quote. Jane devoted Chapter 15 of Adventures to a discussion of the inner order of events and quote-unquote unofficial perceptions. End of footnote. Pause at 10:05. Now Seth took off into some areas involving Jane that were more personal. At the same time, he gave material on the third and then the first of the questions I'd listed during break for the last session. I thought I'd include a few quotations from him on both issues, while eliminating portions of the session that deal with other matters entirely. I think the information on Jane is quite relevant to both her work and her life in general. Give us a moment. I am not here going into Rupert to any great degree, but I do have some information. Obviously, he is in the middle of a learning adventure, trying to do far more with his ordinary consciousness than most people, and trying to solve his problems and encounter his challenges without relying upon old structures of beliefs. He has done this even though he has been working in relatively untried areas, where there underlined seem to be few certainties. Footnote. Material on the psychic and physical challenges that Jane chose to deal with in this life can be found in sessions 708 and 713, among others. In the former, see Seth's delivery after 1140, as well as the notes at the end of the session. In the latter, see the opening notes and Seth's discussion after 1126. End of footnote. The Nature of Personal Reality, our last book, is there for others to follow. Others, however, did not have a hand in producing it. They will try out the ideas, many of them, to the best of their ability, and learn and gain much, all the time, much more forcefully. Underlined, hanging on safely to the banners of conventional beliefs. Rupert has allowed himself no such comforts. He should remember that many people have far greater hassles, with health, personal relationships, finances, and vacations, and without any satisfying accomplishments to offset their misfortunes. Long pause at 10:23, eyes closed. I make recommendations now and then you see fit to follow them. Footnote. See the notes at 10:45 for session 738 concerning, quote, the extent to which we follow Seth's advice or information, end quote. End of footnote. Considering Rupert's challenges, he has done extremely well as he cleared away the debris that literally surrounds the lives of most people. In a way, his progress has been dependent upon the state of his learning, so that he has been trying to stretch the abilities of normal consciousness by drawing in other quote-unquote strands. Footnote. See the opening notes for the 725th session, as well as the session itself for material on strands of consciousness. End of footnote. Yet because he was the one so involved, he had to test each strand, and in the meantime, he still had his quote-unquote old consciousness with its habits to contend with. The Seth material is endless. I organize it for your benefit. If you want to divide it into 2 volumes, that is fine. You will find several points where this can be done, and I will answer any questions that you have. Footnote. I used Seth's lines in this paragraph early in the introductory notes for Volume 1. End of footnote. In a way, Rupert's book, Psychic Politics, will continue our material from another viewpoint while you are preparing underlined our unknown reality. God bless your fingers. They're okay. And a hearty good evening. Thank you, Seth. The same to you. Good night. 11:01 p.m. And so Volume 2 of Unknown Reality is finished. Now I want to briefly summarize for the reader two subjects, house connections and ESP class, that have been mentioned often in the sessions for Section 6. See Notes 13 and 14. Okay, Notes 13 and 14. All right, a few more pages to go here then. Yeah, this is the point where doing a stream of this type and of this length becomes rough. Where like my voice gets tired and my mouth gets tired and my arm gets tired and all this stuff. This one's actually going longer than I think most of the Seth streams in recent times. So, but oh well. An idea I've been thinking of more and more lately is this idea that we are also in large part creatures of experience. And so even as we struggle through things, that helps refine us and make us much better at what we do. So whatever, if it's a bit of a struggle, I guess I'm all for it. During the 10:36 break for session 740, which was held a couple of months ago, I wrote that the list of house connections associated with our move to the Hill House had grown to over 40 items, quote unquote, and continues to grow. Jane and I have now accumulated more than 60 such interrelationships, and they range all the way from color and architectural similarities among the various houses we've either lived in or felt strong emotional and psychic attachments for, to human connections like the following one. It's neither the most inconsequential item on our list or the most spectacular, but recently we learned through a close relative of the Stephens, I'll call them, the couple from whom we bought the Hill House, that at a small social gathering over 2 years ago, Jane had spontaneously given something of a psychic quote-unquote reading for Mrs. Stephens. Moreover, this event had taken place in the apartment house we lived in on Water Street, not in our own quarters there, however, but in the apartment of another tenant whom we've known for a number of years. Jane hadn't met Mrs. Stephens before, and never saw her again. I wasn't involved in the little scenario. The Stephenses moved out of Elmira some months before we purchased the Hill House through a real estate agency. Stranger still, that reading marked one of the few times, and certainly the last, to the best of our mutual recollection, that Jane has, quote-unquote, tuned into an individual under such circumstances. Quote, I just did it because I liked her after we got talking, Jane said, once the Stephenses' relative had reminded her of the affair. But I don't think I precognitively up what we were going to buy, or that we were going to buy their house 2 years later, or anything like that. We didn't know this place, the Hill House, even existed then. Hell, we didn't even know the street existed, end quote. Let me note at the end of this account that the mutual friend who introduced Jane and Mrs. Stephens has participated in some of our other house connections also, a function similar to the one enacted by our new acquaintance, Frank Corio, whom I referred to in Note 11 for Section 740. Jane and I saw this kind of situation develop with several other individuals also, once we began our active house hunting in Sayre, Pennsylvania, in April 1974. It seems, then, that at least on unconscious levels, and for their own reasons also, of course, certain individuals chose to act as catalysts or expediters, helping us to achieve our particular goals. Such role-playing could be studied as an attribute of certain families of consciousness. End of Note 13. Note 14. This final note is added well over a year after Jane finished delivering Unknown Reality. As I wrote at the start of the 740th session, Jane suspended ESP class on February 26, 1975, to give us time to not only prepare for our move to the Hill House in March, but to settle down afterward. As might be expected, the class hiatus soon began to have a ripple effect. The longer we delayed making up our minds as to whether we'd have the time to resume class, the more Jane's students began to scatter. The younger people, especially those who were natives of the area to begin with, began to fan out across the nation and even into foreign lands, continuously searching for more of that indefinable essence or quality many of them called truth. They took Seth's ideas with them, however, and with considerable interest, Jane and I thought of them as not only looking for truths, but meeting counterparts. Why not? Indeed. According to Seth's views, such encounters with other portions of their whole selves would be inevitable. We also applied the counterpart ideas to ourselves. Seth named a number of counterparts among class members in the 732nd session, including, for example, a total of 9 involving Jane and me, counting the psychic relationships between us, and I wrote about those connections in Appendix 25 for that session. As class let me say that again. As class gradually receded into the past, through our own default, as it were, Jane and I kept in touch with some of our local counterparts from class, while we saw less and less of certain others. Each choice seemed to be a matter of mutual unspoken agreement among all concerned, and we kept in mind that each individual had the complete freedom to do as he or she wished about maintaining contact with us, just as we had in our relationships with them. Of my 3 class counterparts other than Jane, then, it developed that Norma Pryor and Jack Pierce soon embarked upon their own paths, which hardly ever cross mine, even though we don't live that far apart. Peter Smith and I still see each other often. On Jane's part, one of her counterparts, Zelda, has traveled far away, although maintaining a tenuous, infrequent contact by mail. Jane has met Alan Koch, but twice physically, yet feels allied with him. Sue Watkins remains close to both of us, by the way, even though she now lives in a small community that's well over an hour's travel north of Elmira. And Jane has seen her 4th counterpart, quote unquote, the young man from Pennsylvania, but once since class stopped meeting. The longer we went without class, the more Jane and I saw how much its demise paralleled the ending of Unknown Reality. Both events were inevitable, we came to understand. Both had had their time. Our regrets about the finishing of both are real, while simultaneously we heartily agree that the nature of life in this physical, or quote-unquote camouflage, reality is one of unending change and renewal. Even though we may never again see many of those counterparts we'd known, we realize that all of us are indissolubly joined, nor is the fact that a number of us are physically separated or invisible to each of the others of great importance. For as Seth told us recently in a private session, quote, in a strange fashion, of course, the word invisibility has meaning only in your kind of world. There is no such thing as true psychological invisibility. The physical world is dependent upon the relationship of everything from electrons to molecules to mountains to oceans. And in the scheme of reality, these are all interwoven with exquisite order, spontaneity, and a logic beyond any with which you are familiar. The counterpart idea is merely a small attempt to hint at that interrelationship, an interrelationship that, of course, includes all species and forms of life. End of note. And, of course, the end of that session and the end of the main part of the book. All right, dear viewers, that is it. While we are not totally done with the Unknown Reality, Volume 2, we are done with the main part of the book, and next time we shall resume with the appendix, specifically Appendix 12, because the appendices 1 through 11 were all in Volume 1 of Unknown Reality. So there you have it. Okay, so let's wrap things up here. Let us see if it gives us any additional information about the appendix sections in the table of contents for the purposes of previews. I forget if it does. Oh, it does, I think. Okay, good. All right, here we go. So, a little preview of next week. Appendix 12, Seth's Ideas on Evolution and Related Subjects, a discussion of evolution as seen by science, religion, and philosophy. And then Appendix 13, Seth on the Consciousness of Trees. All right, so I'll assume that we'll probably get through 2 appendix sections next time, so I'll just leave it at that. Other than that, yes, that's finally it. Finally, the ending of the main part of Volume 2 of The Unknown Reality. So also, I have a bit of an announcement about this. I was thinking of this earlier, and I reserve the right to change my mind, but this is probably the path I will take. I'm thinking that starting probably next week, I am going to do these Seth streams bi-weekly, so every other Monday. So like I will stream next Monday, a week from now. But then the time I stream after that with Seth material will be 2 weeks. So December 30th, as I'm looking at my calendar here. And then 2 weeks again, which won't be till January 13th. So, you can expect that. And the reasoning for that is I feel like I'm getting a lot more interesting ideas as of late for streams. My creativity is increasing. And I'm also, I've always noticed that, unfortunately, even though, as I've said before, I love doing these Seth streams, I think they're just so much fun. They're pretty much the least popular amongst my viewers. I'm thinking it would be advantageous to me, and it would be desirable on part of my viewers overall, my audience, if there were like fewer Seth streams and more like of the other stuff that I plan on doing streams on in the very near future. And so ideally, it would probably turn out to be the case that there would be like 2 or 3, maybe even 4 sometimes, other streams of other kinds between Seth streams, so that we can have a nice variety of content and we don't have too much of one thing at once. So yeah, that is my plan. And yes, that means it's going to take twice as long to get through these Seth books, but I don't know, whatever, it's worth it. It's like, well, what are we going to do? Just give up on them completely? I mean, the time will pass anyway, so we might as well do these things. So I want to thank you guys for watching. See if there's anything else that I want to say before we wrap up. Coming to you from an unusually warm December night. It's hard to believe, though, that it's almost officially winter again. It will soon be Capricorn season again in just like not even 2 weeks from now. But fear not, the temperature may be going down, but the quality of my content, if I have anything to do with it, will only continue to go up higher and higher and higher. So yeah, thanks again. I might be back Wednesday. I'm not sure yet, but I'll definitely be back on Friday if everything goes my way with a very, what will hopefully be a very good and satisfying stream to myself and all of you. So have a great night, everyone, and I'll see you next time.